Chapter 7, Lesson 2, A Railroad to California, page 232. Vocabulary in the section, transcontinental, engineer, investor, strike. Build on what you know. What is the fastest way people can travel today? What do you think was the fastest way in the 1860s? A transcontinental railroad. Main idea. Businesses and government worked together to build a railroad across the United States. By 1861, telegraph lines and stagecoaches linked California to the eastern United States. However, many people wanted faster transportation. Trains were the fastest form of travel at the time, yet there was no transcontinental railroad to link the western and eastern United States. A transcontinental railroad crosses a continent. The Sacramento Valley Railroad, shown below. This was the very first railroad ride in California. If you look at the next page, you'll see a photo on the top of a ceremony that was held in Sacramento to celebrate the start of work on the Continental Railroad. It took place on January 8th, 1863. The Big Four. Theodore Judah was an engineer who planned railroads. An engineer designs and builds things. Judah helped build the first railroad in California in 1854. This railroad ran from Sacramento to San Francisco. When it was finished, Judah wanted to build a transcontinental railroad. In 1861, Judah convinced 4 California investors that a railroad across the country was a good idea. An investor puts money into a business in the hope of earning more money in the future. Investors Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins became famous and known as the Big Four. The Pacific Railway Act. The Big Four started the Central Pacific Railroad Company. They asked lawmakers in Congress to hire their company to build a transcontinental railroad. In 1862, Congress passed a law called the Pacific Railway Act. This law set aside money for a transcontinental railroad. Part of the money went to the Central Pacific Railroad Company. This company would build track east from California. The other part went to the Union Pacific Railroad Company to build track west from Nebraska. Review. Name the Big Four and tell us what they did. Page 234. Building the railroad. Main idea. The Transcontinental Railroad was difficult to build. On January 8, 1863, workers for the Central Pacific Railroad Company began to build track stretching east from Sacramento, California. To get tracks across the steep Sierra Nevada, workers had to make a level path for the track. They cut passes through hills and built tunnels. They filled in low land and built bridges across valleys. They laid track across this rugged land, and then they built sheds to protect the tracks from heavy mountain snow. Hard work. There were no bulldozers or dump trucks then to make this work go faster. Workers used picks, shovels, axes, wheelbarrows, and sledgehammers. They used gunpowder to blast away rocks. They worked from sunup to sundown 6 days a week. At first, the Central Pacific hired only about 800 workers. To get the work done as quickly as it needed to be done, however, the company needed at least 4,000 more workers. In 1865, the company began to hire Chinese immigrants. By 1869, 9 out of 10 Central Pacific workers were Chinese immigrants. The photo below shows a map of the steep mountains. Workers for both companies had to cross very steep mountains and work in harsh weather. Poor conditions. By the time the first railroad across the continent was completed, more than 15,000 Chinese immigrants had worked on it. Many came to California for the gold rush and worked on the railroads after the gold rush ended. Others came from China to earn money doing railroad work. Chinese workers were paid less than other workers and worked longer hours. In June 1867, 2,000 Chinese workers went on strike. A strike is when workers stop doing their jobs to protest working conditions or get higher pay. A lasting contribution. When the workers went on strike, Crocker cut off their supply of food. Workers were forced to end the strike. Although the Big Four did not improve working conditions, they needed the Chinese workers. Without them, it would be impossible to complete the western portion of this great national enterprise, wrote Leland Stanford in a report to the President of the United States. Review. Why was the Transcontinental Railroad difficult to build? Below, you'll see a photo of 3 different Union Pacific workers during this time. Completing the railroad. Main idea. The Transcontinental Railroad brought people and businesses to California. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific workers laid tracks westward from Nebraska. Many of these workers came from Ireland. Many were former soldiers, too. For this reason, they were sometimes called the Sledge and Shovel Army. A sledgehammer was called a sledge. The government gave companies land and large loans of money for each mile of track they laid. As the 2 sets of track drew closer together, workers raced to lay more miles of track than workers for the other company. The Golden Spike. On May 10, 1869, the 2 lines met near Promontory, Utah. 8 Chinese workers, chosen to honor the work of immigrants, laid the last section of track. Leland Stanford joined the lines by driving a golden spike with a silver hammer. Telegraph lines spread the news across the nation. The railroad increased trade with Asia and other parts of the United States. Merchants shipped goods by train between California and the eastern United States. They shipped goods by boat from Asia to California and then by train to the rest of the United States. The painting below in the Sierra Nevada, this painting by Mian Situ shows railroad workers with sledgehammers. They are getting ready to blast rocks. Wealth for railroad companies. The owners of the railroads took a big risk, but they earned millions of dollars. Customers paid to travel and transport goods on trains. Land along the rail lines became very valuable. People bought land from the companies to build houses, farms, and businesses. The Central Pacific gained great wealth from its land in California. Review. What were 2 ways that the railroad companies earned money? The Yuba Gap Channel. The photo at the left. Today, trains still travel through tunnels like those built for the first Transcontinental Railroad. Lesson summary. The Transcontinental Railroad was built by the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific companies. Most of the workers on the Central Pacific Railroad were Chinese immigrants. The Transcontinental Railroad increased business in California. Why it matters. The first Transcontinental Railroad made California's economy grow.